parliamentary speaker tomorrow after corruption findings against incumbent Kazai Purik. Scientists call for a moratorium on land clearing after the devastating impact on wildlife of the summer's bushfires. Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Ros Childs. There have been 16 new cases of coronavirus reported in Victoria in the past 24 hours. The state government will ramp up its testing program in the 6 local government areas now designated as hotspots as the state grapples with the spike in infections. Reporter Stephanie Ferrier has the latest developments from Melbourne.
There are 16 new cases in Victoria that have been detected. They include another Black Lives Matter protester, a toddler at a childcare centre in Melbourne's north, as well as another teacher that was in Caroline Springs in Melbourne's west as well. So we'll just go through some of these details. Of the 11, there is a net increase of 11 actually since yesterday because some of those have been reallocated and removed due to duplication. So the 16 is actually officially 11 once you take that into account. Of the 11, we got told that 6 are linked to outbreaks. 4 are among returned travellers who are currently in hotel quarantine. 5 were picked up during routine testing and 1 remains under investigation. Now, what is really worrying health authorities here is that the number of community transmissions, that is the number of cases where health investigators have not been able to actually pinpoint an exact cause, has jumped by 12. So that is quite a significant increase in the number of community transmissions. Now, there's 125 active cases, 9 are in hospital. That's also a jump up, and 2 of those are in intensive care. Now, of some of these cases, we have heard that there are 2 new cases that are linked to the Albanvale Primary School in Caroline Springs, which is in Melbourne's west, and that brings the total number of cases there to 3. Now, Jenny Mikakos, as you mentioned, the Victorian Health Minister, has just been talking about this. Let's have a listen to what she had to say about this particular cluster.
We have been concerned that some people may be taking some risks with their health and with the health of others by still going out into the community, even though they might have gone for a test, they haven't yet received a test result, or may have been identified as a close contact. If you go and get tested, you must stay at home until you receive your test result. Typically in recent weeks, that's now come down to around about a 2-day turnaround. So we ask people to take this very seriously because you could be infectious and could be spreading the virus to others in the community.
I guess the message is not that you shouldn't have concerns outside of these LGAs or indeed across all of the areas of the LGAs. Yes, there is a more granular risk within them, and our intelligence team understand that and will dig into it more and more as new cases emerge. And so we can say more definitive things, and we'll target our testing and our actions and door knocking and community engagement based on that more granular picture. But in terms of a message, we don't want to say only think about these spots or avoid these spots and be complacent everywhere else.
So that's Victoria's Chief Health Officer, Professor Brett Sutton, speaking there. Now, just in terms of those other cases that they know about, there were 2 further cases linked to the H&M shopping centre in Northland. That brings that cluster to 4. 1 is a household staff member of household contact, of a previous staff member who tested positive, and the 3rd staff member was that person who attended the Black Lives Matter protest. Now, Jenny Mikakos mentioned that it's not thought that particular protester acquired the virus as a result of attending that rally, and that that particular person was wearing a mask at the time. Now, there is another case as well at a childcare centre in Melbourne's north. This is a toddler who attended the Great Beginnings nursery in Reservoir while infectious, so that centre has been closed while they undertake a deep clean and try and determine close contacts of that toddler as well.
OK, Steph, thank you. The situation in Victoria is worrying the premiers of other states, which have far fewer reported cases. In New South Wales, there have been 2 new cases, while Queensland has had none. Reporter Jessie Dorset is in Sydney.
Almost 9,000 tests were taken across New South Wales in the past 24 hours. Ros, they've detected 2 new infections. One is a return traveller in hotel quarantine, so that's not a major concern. That's the system working as it should. But the other is a man in his 30s in Western Sydney. Authorities say he hasn't travelled recently and he hasn't attended any mass gatherings like a protest. So where did he get coronavirus? Authorities are trying to work that out now. Officials are also closely watching the situation in Victoria because school holidays start there on Saturday. Here in New South Wales, there are a few schools that also break up this week and the ski season kicks off. So there'll be a lot more people travelling between the states. The New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian has confirmed she won't close the Victorian border, but she has this to say to anyone thinking about travelling to Melbourne.
As is consistent with the health advice from Victoria and also New South Wales, nobody from New South Wales should be travelling to those hotspots at this present time, and people should consider whether they should be travelling to Melbourne at this point in time whilst community transmission is where it is.
Jessie, what's the impact of that spike in Victoria having on the Queensland Premier's decision about her state borders?
No new cases again in Queensland. That state's done really well to stop the spread of this virus, Ros. And so they're also a bit concerned about what's happening in Victoria and the potential for it to jeopardise their success. So the Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk says authorities will decide at the end of the month when to reopen their state borders. She won't be rushed, and here's why.
I have concerns about Victoria. The Health Minister has concerns about Victoria. There is a lot of active community transmission happening in Victoria, and I hope that Victoria can get this community transmission under control.
And Ros, as far as Queensland health authorities are concerned, all of Greater Melbourne and some surrounding areas, 31 local government areas are COVID hotspots. So anyone returning to Queensland from those places must quarantine for 2 weeks.
Thanks, Jessie. Let's stay with the worsening situation in Victoria and those hotspots in and around Melbourne. The host of the Health Report on RN and of the Coronacast podcast, Norman Swan, assesses whether these areas should be locked down.
The rise in cases in Victoria is really troubling because you're seeing double digits each day, but if you actually look at the rolling 14-day average, which is really more on the cycle of how this virus reproduces, it's gone from about, in a relatively few days, it's doubled actually. They've had a doubling. They've had, rolling average was maybe 80 about the 6th of June, I think, and it's now about 150 or so. I might have those figures slightly wrong, but it's roughly doubled. And it was, I think, a day or so ago it was 135 and today it's 150. That's the rolling average of the cumulative number of cases. So that gives you an idea of how it's going up and the rapid and the rise, the acceleration, and that tells you why Victoria is so worried. If you just see a handful of cases each day, you think, well, why are they getting so concerned? It's because of that cumulative number of cases out there. And it's also that it's in the community. Yep. It's spreading in families, spreading in households, but it's not just households, it's spread from hotel quarantine. And there's been a healthcare outbreak as well, I understand, from a general practitioner who's spread it, I think, to about 13 people is what I understand.
What about these virus hotspots in parts of the city of Melbourne? How should the government handle this, in other words? Well,
far be it from me to tell them how to handle it, but they're doing this textbook stuff. So when you've not got a mass pandemic out there, we've kind of controlled that, and you've got outbreaks, textbook tells you, you find the case or the cases, you ring it around maybe a 5-kilometre radius, and then you intensively test and seek out cases in that area. And you might go to partial lockdown or stop people moving around so that you can control the case. That's how we controlled smallpox. It's how we can control this one. But, compared to centuries gone by, people can catch a tram or a train and go from Darebin into the city. You know the story. It can spread quite dramatically from there.
So does this add to the argument then for people to wear masks, especially on public transport?
Cannot understand why we are not insisting on masks throughout, particularly New South Wales and Victoria. It's been shown by WHO and others, good review, is that it can cut down the spread by 60 or 70%. And we are in a high-risk situation where we're coming out of restrictions. At a national level, they've always been against masks, same way as they've been always against shutting down schools. Don't know what they're worried about by doing this. If we went to masks where we can't socially isolate easily, indoors, public transport, office spaces, malls, we cannot open cinemas and allow people to go in there without masks on. Just can't do it. This is mad stuff. Particularly in Victoria, but here too, in New South, we're speaking New South Wales. Other states could probably be a bit more relaxed, like Queensland, where there's almost no virus around. But we should be insisting on masks as we come out of this. You may only have to do it for a month or so, but it could make the difference.
A lot of talk about the implication of the spike in Victoria on other states and borders. What are the implications and the threat, if we want to use that word, to other states?
Well, it's hard to know exactly what the right answer here is, but if Victorians are saying, if the Victorian government is saying to Victorians who live in Darebin, try not to travel out of Darebin, it's pretty hard not to say to Victorians, don't travel out of Victoria. So, there's not a lot of virus around, it's just increasing rapidly, and we need to be prudent. And I'm not quite sure what the story should be about borders, but we need to be very careful.
More on the health report tonight on our own at 5:30.
Yes,
see you once again.
And 7:30 tonight as well.
And 7:30 tonight.
Yep.
See you then. Norman, thanks.
You're welcome.
And we are expecting to hear more from the Chief Medical Officer, Brendan Murphy, later this hour. That's coming up in around 20 minutes' time. Labor has accused the coalition of trying to smash the superannuation system as a growing number of government MPs voice their opposition to raising the rate of compulsory super. Some argue the scheduled change will cripple businesses already hurting from the pandemic. Noor Haydar has the latest from Parliament House in Canberra.
Some government MPs are urging the Morrison government to delay lifting the superannuation guarantee. This is not a new issue. It has always been a contentious matter within the coalition. It is legislated to rise from its current rate of 9.5% to 10% in July of 2021, and then progressively continue to rise to 12% by 2025. Now, the issue is currently the subject of a wide-ranging review into the retirement income system that is due to be released later this week, and the Nine newspapers are reporting that there are some 10 coalition backbenchers who are opposed to this increase from going ahead. Amongst them is Tim Wilson. He argues that it will cost jobs and wages. The former Deputy Prime Minister, Barnaby Joyce, also this morning raising his opposition to this superannuation guarantee being increased. He says it will cripple businesses that have already been hurt by the coronavirus crisis. He says it's not practical to do it at this time. However, we have heard from the Prime Minister just a short time ago. He appeared reluctant to really want to weigh in on this, except for saying that there are no plans to change the existing policy, which currently provides for the superannuation guarantee to be increased.
The government is focused on every single measure that can keep people in jobs and get people into new jobs. And we have policies in place. If policies get reviewed at any point in time, well, that's a consideration for that time. That's not something that's occurring at the moment. What we're doing right now is we are focused on getting people back into jobs, and reopening the economy is a critical part of that.
Nor the opposition has already raised concerns about this, describing it as another ideological attack on superannuation.
That's right. Labor, of course, viewing this as an attack on the superannuation system, something that they say the coalition has tried to dismantle repeatedly. The compulsory superannuation rate was frozen at 9.5% back in 2014 under the Abbott government. Labor says the coalition cannot be trusted with superannuation policy. They, of course, have pointed to the government's decision to allow people to dip into their superannuation during the COVID-19 crisis. They say that will have a long-lasting impact on young people and women in particular. We heard earlier today from the Shadow Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, and he says that the coalition has repeatedly attempted to diminish superannuation.
Give me a break. This attack on super is not something that the Labor Party or the workers of Australia will cop. We've already seen under the life of this 7-year-old government that the Liberals have frozen superannuation again and again, and we've still seen stagnant wages and rampant underemployment after that.
And that's the Shadow Treasurer Jim Chalmers there saying that the COVID-19 crisis shouldn't be used as an excuse to change the existing policy.
Thanks, Noel. The lawyer defending the man accused of Perth's Claremont serial killings is continuing his closing address as the 6-month trial nears an end. Former Telstra technician Bradley Edwards denies abducting and murdering 3 young women who all disappeared from a Perth night spot in the 1990s. Charlotte Hamlin is covering the trial and joins us now from Perth. So Charlotte, what have you heard from the defence so far?
Hello, Ros. Well, lawyer Paul Jovich began his closing submissions last week by focusing on a tiny fragment of DNA found under the fingernails of one of the victims. It is not disputed that it belongs to Bradley Edwards, but the defence says it could have got there by way of contamination while that sample was being stored in WA's pathology lab. Today, he's now moved on to the propensity element of the state's case against Bradley Edwards. He denies murdering Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer and Kira Glennon, who all disappeared from Claremont in 1996 and 1997. But he has admitted to 3 other attacks on women in the years before the Claremont disappearances. That includes the violent abduction and rape of a 17-year-old girl who was taken from the streets of Claremont in 1995 and sexually assaulted in a nearby cemetery. That victim is in court today as defence lawyer Mr Jovich is going back through the details of that very confronting crime. He's trying to illustrate that while Edwards is an admitted rapist, he never had any intention to kill that woman, and therefore he's trying to dispel the prosecution theory that over the years his crimes escalated in their severity and their violence. He's also today focused on Telstra clothing fibres. We know that Bradley Edwards is a former Telstra technician. They were found on that rape victim, and the same fibres were also found on 2 of the Claremont murder victims. And the state says that those clothing fibres connect 3 cases. Mr Jovich has raised questions over how those fibres could have come to be on the sexual assault victim, and whether they can be relied upon as evidence in the state's case, whether perhaps they too got there as a result of cross-contamination. So he's continuing that line of discussion today.
Charlotte, what more are you expecting from these closing submissions?
Well, they've gone for some time and we're expecting them to go for some time longer. We expect Mr Jovich to continue to explore that fibres evidence in a lot more detail. He'll then turn to what's been known throughout this trial as the Telstra living witness evidence. That's several reports from people who frequented the Claremont area back at the time of those disappearances and reported seeing a Telstra vehicle or something that looked similar to a Telstra vehicle driving around the streets of Claremont and nearby Cottesloe and picking up women. The defence says there's no evidence to suggest that the person in those witness reports was Bradley Edwards, and we're expecting him to try to cast doubt on that prosecution theory that he was the person in that vehicle. Once the defence wraps up its closing submissions, and we're expecting that to happen sometime in the next couple of days, the judge will then retire to consider what's been a long-awaited and highly anticipated verdict in this case.
Thanks, Charlotte. The anti-corruption watchdog in the Northern Territory has found the parliamentary speaker responsible for serious breaches of public trust. Reporter Jane Barden has the details.
Well, the ICAC head, Ken Fleming, has found that the Speaker basically tried to interfere in the formation of a new party in the Northern Territory, which was going to be called the North Australian Party, and she directed her staffer to basically work out whether that name was already registered so that one of her old political opponents, Terry Mills, couldn't register the name and start a new party. But what the Commissioner has found is that she also then denied having any involvement in using what should be an independent office with independent resources to do that, and that she allowed her staffer, Martine Smith, to basically take the rap for this attempted interference. The Commissioner also found that this had happened in November 2018, but when he was investigating it up to last month, that the Speaker denied again in questioning to his office that she had done this, and that she's potentially committed an offence under the ICAC Act by doing that as well.
And what's been the reaction from the government?
The Chief Minister, Michael Gunner, has said that he's asked the Speaker to consider resigning. Labour has massive numbers, though, in the Parliament in majority, and so if the Speaker doesn't voluntarily resign, it can use its numbers to remove Kezia Purick as the Speaker. It's an interesting situation because the government, in theory, you would think that they would have taken the Speaker's position, but they've basically allowed Kezia Purick, who's been a close ally of Labour, to hold that role. So there's a bit of tension in that decision there. But this is what the Chief Minister, Michael Gunner, has said about this today.
My responsibility has always been about saving lives and saving jobs and doing whatever it takes to tackle coronavirus. I thought it was an appalling act, to be honest. To try and think about taking opposition status during coronavirus. It was something that filled me with disgust. But let it be said, that's, again, a matter for them. I'm worried about coronavirus and saving Territory lives.
And so, basically, we haven't yet heard from the Speaker what her intention is, but it's a very serious situation for the whole reputation of the Territory Parliament and particularly for the future of her office.
Thanks, Jane. Finance news now. Here's David Chow. David, there have been some developments with Virgin Australia. What's been happening?
Well, Ros, the bidding war is coming to an end soon. So the two final bidders, private equity firms, Bain Capital and Cyrus Capital, they've submitted their final bids for the airline, and the administrator Deloitte will consider them and make a decision by 30th of June, which is about 8 days away. So both companies have received approval from the Foreign Investment Review Board, the regulator in dealing with this matter, and also they will run an airline. If either of them is successful, it'll be a smaller airline which will mainly focus on domestic with some short-haul international flights. So it will depend on the timing and the level of demand from travellers, and I guess how quickly COVID-19 restrictions get lifted for the travel industry as well. So there's still a lot of uncertainty. So we don't know how much has been paid or what the offers are, but it's expected to be in the billions. After all, Virgin owes about nearly $7 billion worth of debt to about 12,000 creditors.
So we'll know more June the 30th, 8 days' time.
Yeah, we should have more clarity by then, Ros.
Now, the market then, the overall share market has rebounded. What's going on?
Yeah, interesting one. It was a bit of a shaky start this morning. The ASX 200 dropped by 1%, but then it slowly recovered since then, and now we're in positive territory. So what made our market fall this morning was the spike in COVID cases in the US as well as Victoria, but the market seems to have gotten over that very quickly. So right now, the ASX 200, that is up by about 1/3%. The All Ords doing not as well, but still in positive territory. The All Ords up about 1/4%. Now, when we take a look at the top and bottom movers, James Hardie Industries is doing very well. Well, many of the best performing stocks are gold miners, like Silver Lake Resources and Saracen Minerals. So when gold stocks are doing well, that usually means the market is feeling very nervous. James Hardie, as you can see, up 8.5%, and that was after the building product supplier said it's going to earn more revenue than expected this quarter. But travel stocks are getting smashed, like Flight Centre, Qantas and Webjet. Now, things are picking up in Asia-Pacific markets too. Shanghai and Tokyo have risen by 1/3%, roughly in line with the Aussie share market. Hong Kong and New Zealand have fallen modestly, down about 0.4%. Now, this morning, the Aussie market was following a weak lead from Wall Street. On Friday, the Dow Jones fell by 200 points, or 0.8%, while the S&P 500 was down 0.6%. But the Nasdaq bucked the trend once again. It actually finished slightly higher, boosted by tech stocks. Gold prices have shot up on fears of a second wave of COVID-19 infections, and oil prices had a big jump over the weekend on hopes that the world's biggest oil-producing nations will reduce their oversupply. Now, the Australian dollar has risen quite a bit to about 68.5 US cents. It comes as the Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe says the currency is not overvalued since Australia is handling the coronavirus better than other countries. Dr. Lowe was speaking on a panel about COVID-19 and the global economy this morning. And finally, Australian consumers have lost over $634 million due to scams last year, the latest figures from the ACCC have revealed. The consumer regulator says more than 350,000 scams were reported last year. The biggest losses came from business email scams, which cost the business community and individuals more than $130 million. This was followed by investment scams, which cost Australians $126 million, as well as dating and online scams, which resulted in $83 million worth of losses. And that's it for finance this hour, Ros.
Thanks, David. The deadly stabbing attack west of London at the weekend is being treated as a terrorist attack. A 25-year-old, originally from Libya, is being held on suspicion of killing 3 people as they sat in a park in Reading. He'd reportedly come to the attention of the British Security Service last year, but was not thought to be an immediate risk. Europe correspondent Linton Besser reports.
25-year-old Khairi Saadallah had fled Libya's civil war and sought asylum in Britain. But on the weekend, he allegedly shattered the peace he'd once sought out, turning Reading's Forbury Gardens into a crime scene.
He darted round anti-clockwise the circle, got one, went to another, stabbed the next one, went to another, stabbed the next one.
Lawrence Wart wasn't sure what was happening until he saw the attacker coming towards him.
And then he stood up and I saw a massive knife in his hand, probably at least 5 inches minimum, and then he turned and started looking towards us, and that's when I just started shouting, "Run!"
When the local police arrived, they tackled the man and held him on suspicion of murder.
Within 5 minutes of the first call, officers had apprehended a man and made an arrest. He remains in police custody at this time.
Later that night, specialist officers raided a nearby apartment building. And by the next morning, the investigation had been transferred to the police's counter-terrorism command. This is the 3rd terrorism incident so far this year in Britain, and the latest in a rash of lone wolf stabbing attacks that are highly difficult for law enforcement and security agencies to prevent.
From our inquiries undertaken so far, officers have found nothing to suggest that there was anyone else involved in this attack.
Late on Sunday, Khairi Saadallah emerged as the man in custody, with reports he was previously known to the security services, who believed he had mental health and violence problems. One of the men killed, local teacher James Furlong.
I'm appalled and sickened that people should lose their lives in this way. If there are lessons that we need to learn about how we handle such cases, how we handle the events leading up to such cases, then we will learn those lessons.
This is the 5th lone wolf attack in the UK by a perpetrator using a knife since December 2018. Linton Besser, ABC News, London.
In the run-up to his first campaign rally in more than 3 months, US President Donald Trump had boasted that almost 1 million people had registered an interest in attending the event. When the event in Tulsa, Oklahoma began, large sections of the 19,000-seat venue were left empty.
Look at Donald Trump's face as the door on Air Force One opens. Is he happy to be back on the road again? He's delighted. But he'd have been less than thrilled by what he saw at the venue. He'd said in the week that 1 million had signed up for tickets, but the overflow was empty, and inside, acres of empty seats. The arena has a capacity of 19,000. The fire marshal today confirmed there were only 6,200 present.
I stand before you today to declare the silent majority is stronger than ever before.
More like the absent majority. Despite speaking for over an hour and a half, not once did he mention George Floyd or the police brutality that led to his death. Instead, he focused on the protesters and how his 2020 rival, Joe Biden, would be in their pocket.
When the chips are down, Biden will always cave to the radical left. He'll always bow to the angry mob, and he will never protect you or your family, and you know that.
There was no attempt at social distancing in this indoor arena, and hardly anyone wore a mask. Coronavirus is going up in many US states like Oklahoma, for which the president had an answer.
When you do testing to that extent, you're going to find more people, you're going to find more cases. So I said to my people, slow the testing down, please.
A weary-looking Donald Trump arrived back at the White House in the small hours of this morning, looking dishevelled and quite possibly disgruntled. The joy from the start of the day long gone. In politics, the art is to under-promise and over-deliver. But Donald Trump predicted 1 million and only got a few thousand. He said it would be safe, and 6 of his campaign staffers have contracted coronavirus. And his comments about slowing down testing later had to be clarified by the White House as a joke. This is not the relaunch that Donald Trump wanted.
Quick look at the national weather now. Sunny in Brisbane, Sydney and Canberra partly cloudy, showers in Melbourne, rain in Hobart, Adelaide and Perth showers developing, and sunny in Darwin. And a reminder, you can keep up to date on today's top stories at news.abc.net.au and of course on iView. Top stories on ABC News. Victoria has recorded another day of double-digit coronavirus cases with 16 people diagnosed overnight. 6 cases are linked to known outbreaks and 4 are in hotel quarantine. Victoria accounts for 83% of the new cases recorded nationally in the past 7 days. There are concerns the rise in COVID-19 cases in Victoria could stall the reopening of state and territory borders. The New South Wales Premier has encouraged people to reconsider any travel plans to Melbourne, but says the border between the 2 states remains open. And Queensland's Premier says the situation in Victoria will factor into any decision on reopening her state's borders. The Northern Territory's anti-corruption watchdog has found the Speaker of the NT Legislative Assembly, Kezia Purick, responsible for corrupt conduct and serious breaches of public trust. The ICAC launched an investigation last year after a complaint from 2 independents in relation to their attempt to establish a new party. A report handed to Chief Minister Michael Gunner today found Ms Purick intervened in the attempted creation of a political party and misled the ICAC under oath. Local government representatives from Queensland have told the Bushfire Royal Commission their sector needs to be represented at National Cabinet so they're not cut out of disaster management decisions during bushfires. The Local Government Association of Queensland believes the Commonwealth's new National Cabinet arrangements do not adequately include the local government sector. Well, we are standing by to take you live to Canberra, where Chief Medical Officer Brendan Murphy is due to provide a COVID-19 update. That's the scene there now. We'll cross there, of course, as soon as Brendan Murphy appears. Let's stay with the increase in COVID-19 cases in Victoria and the warnings to stay away from 6 regions in Melbourne identified as virus hotspots. Professor Mark Stuver is the head of public health at the Burnet Institute. He explains why Victoria is seeing this increase in cases when other parts of the country seem to have got outbreaks under control.
Look, according to the DHHS and the public statements that have been released, most of these outbreaks relate to relatively small clusters of transmissions within family networks and extended family networks, as well as some clusters that are emerging from some of the quarantine facilities in Melbourne.
What's your reaction to the declaration of virus hotspots around Melbourne and the advice to stay away from those parts of the city? Is this the right way to handle this spike?
Look, I think firstly, I think we're in quite a luxurious position to even be able to, talk about locking down particular areas or restricting movements or recommending restricted movements in particular areas. This is the type of sort of geospatial targeting that couldn't happen in other countries around the world because of the generalised transmission, and even in Victoria, dating back to late March, early April, when we were recording around 100 cases a day, they were popping up all over the place. So I think the fact that we're able to target specific geographic locations in Melbourne with particular recommendations, I think is firstly a testament to our response to the high rate of testing and the extensive contact tracing that is occurring in DHHS. It will be difficult to enforce, obviously. These are large geographic spaces, significant population areas. I think that the messaging is really around just trying to restrict movement of people in and out of those spaces as much as possible. If you don't need to go in and out of those areas, then the recommendations are that you don't. And this is about trying to prevent onward community transmissions. At the moment, they're relatively confined clusters, and the department wants to keep them as cluster outbreaks. What they don't want to see is, relatively unconnected or, random connections amongst people, outside of these clusters, and, representing transmissions in the broader community.
It is advice only though, Mark, isn't it? So do you think people in these regions will follow that advice? After all, Victoria is in this position because it seems many people, particularly family groups, haven't been following the rules. We are taking you live now to Canberra, where Chief Medical Officer Brendan Murphy is providing a coronavirus update.
On the coronavirus situation nationally, I think obviously all the attention at the moment is on Victoria. We've had 18 new cases in the country overnight, 2 in New South Wales, 1 overseas traveller, which, as we say, we don't worry too much about them being detected in hotel quarantine, and 1 under investigation, and 16 new cases in Victoria. 4 overseas travellers in hotel quarantine, 7 linked to those, or currently linked to those outbreaks that we've been hearing about over the weekend, and 5 under investigation. So that's a second small drop in the number of cases over the last 3 days in Victoria. We always expected to see some continuing cases in Victoria given the peak that occurred towards the end of last week. It's still too early to say how the Victorian outbreaks are going, but they are throwing every resource at this. Their public health response is extensive. There's substantial testing happening in those hotspot areas. They are tracing very large numbers of contacts, several hundred contacts of cases, and are responding in a way that I have every confidence they are doing everything they can to bring these outbreaks under control. As I think we have said on many occasions, with our suppression strategy, that is our national strategy, that is to suppress this virus to very, very low levels. We have achieved elimination in some parts of the country for periods of time, but we know that that's a very precarious situation. There is always risks of importation of the virus and further cases across Australia. We know that this virus is escalating around the world. Over 150,000 new cases around the world each day. So the risk is there for the long term. We have done so well in Australia. And our strategy always envisaged that we'd get some outbreaks, and this outbreak in Victoria did concern us. There's no question about that. The rate of rise and the fact that it was community transmission late last week caused significant concern, and that's why HPPC, with the blessing of the Victorian authorities, put in that warning about avoiding those local government areas in metropolitan Melbourne where there are currently active cases. Our testing remains very strong. We've done 2.1 million tests across a population of 26 million, which is pretty impressive. But it is absolutely crucial that in every part of the country, even those parts of the country where there are no known active cases, if people get symptoms, develop any of those upper respiratory symptoms we've talked about for so long, that they go to one of the many places where they can get tested and be tested. Fortunately, despite these new cases, we have had no more deaths. We're still on our same death number, and we still have very low numbers of people in hospital, only 2 people in intensive care. So the cases, particularly these Victorian cases, are largely in fitter younger people with mild disease, but the concern is the potential to spread. So I'll stop there and take questions. Thank you.
How important is hotel quarantine and effective infection control in the hotels going forward as we have more Australians coming back into the country?
Yeah, hotel quarantine has been one of our most successful public health interventions. There have been tens of thousands of people now who have been through hotel quarantine, and we have detected hundreds of people with coronavirus, successfully isolated them in quarantine. It has been a hugely successful endeavour, and one that we are committed for the time being to continue. So obviously it is important that we learn how to do it well. In fact, the HPPC discussed today that we would do some work in coming days to look at what every jurisdiction has learnt, what lessons they've learnt well about how to make it work effectively and with the best protection to all of those involved. So it's a critical resource.
You said a week ago hotel quarantine is not perfect. In New Zealand, when they had a breach, they called in the military.
Yep.
Is there a point where we would need to bring in some stronger enforcement?
I think every state and territory is looking at the hotel quarantine. There have been a very small number of breaches considering the vast number of people going through it, but we are reviewing our national strategy in hotel quarantine over coming weeks. In terms of the military has been a resource that the Prime Minister has offered to each state and territory throughout this pandemic. Whenever they need help, the ADF has been there. They set up the Howard Springs quarantine in Darwin and ran it extremely well. So the ADF have been a great resource. At the moment, no state and territory needs their resource, but that offer is there. Yeah.
In terms of this outbreak, when exactly does an outbreak become what we deem a second wave?
There is no definite definition of that. If this outbreak escalated and we had several hundred cases, that would be the sort of situation where I would be extremely concerned. But there is no official definition of a second wave. It's a concept where the outbreak is such that we don't think the public health measures can easily control it in the short term. So there's no specific definition. At the moment, I have great confidence in the Victorian response. This obviously was of concern. They are responding very, very effectively, and we need to watch things over the next few days to see how it happens. But I think the early signs are that it's not escalating at the moment. We have to make sure that it's brought under control.
Your colleague Nick Coatsworth said the other day that the distancing and other rules would be in place until there's a vaccine or an effective treatment. Can you explain what an effective treatment might look like?
So an effective treatment would be for severe disease. We know that the great majority of people who get coronavirus, fortunately, have a relatively mild disease. It might knock them around a bit like a flu does, but it doesn't threaten their life. So where all the treatment work is being done is looking at severe disease. And you saw the reports from the UK on the use of corticosteroid, dexamethasone, which had some benefit. Not enough of a benefit to say that it can prevent severe disease, but antiviral drugs and other things that can be targeted so that most people with severe disease can recover from it. If we had that, then you would be in a different position about the worry of the spread of the virus, because we're not so much worried about the fit young people who might get mildly unwell, except that they're the ones who transmit, and they're the ones who can infect the elderly and the vulnerable, and they're the ones who die.
Could you comment on any concerns you have with regard to the Victorian outbreak, with school holidays coming up, the likelihood of interstate travel, particularly ski fields and going?
So I think that's why, yes, there are concerns. School holidays are always a concern for travel from a normal place of residence to another place where you might, if you were infected, you might seed the virus. So that's why the recommendation has been made that people in those hotspots in Melbourne, although there are relatively low numbers of cases in each of those hotspots, only a handful, but nevertheless we don't know whether there might be more. So that's why the recommendation is people from those areas don't travel to interstate, to their family groups, and don't travel to the regions in Victoria, particularly if they were going to gather in a large group of people.
On interstate travel, obviously some state borders are still closed, and the premiers of those states are saying that they want to be very cautious given this spike in Victoria. Is that fair enough, just to be quite cautious regarding that restriction?
I think their caution at the moment is understandable. I understand their anxiety. As you know, we've never recommended at HPPC interstate borders be closed as part of our suppression strategy, but I do understand their concern about what's happened over the last weekend, and I think they'll watch the situation, but it's a matter for them.
Professor, in layman's terms, if you can, obviously Victoria went further than the other states in restrictions, and yet we're seeing this sort of outbreak here. Can you explain why that would be the case? Why we're sort of seeing that? If Victoria has gone harder, you'd think that things like illumination would have been more successful there.
Look, I think there's a lot of luck in this. But both Victoria and New South Wales had by far the largest number of initial cases from return travellers, and both New South Wales and Victoria have been our concerns in terms of community transmission. Community transmission has been present in both of those states. New South Wales have very fortunately been in a much stronger position in recent weeks. It's not really possible to say why they have managed to bring community transmission under better control than Victoria. There could be a lot of reasons for that, the geography, the demography of where the outbreaks are. But I think the most important thing is that both states have really good public health responses. New South Wales has had to do responses like Victoria. Remember the Bondi Beach outbreak? They set up pop-up clinics. They ramped up their response. They brought it under control. That's what Victoria is doing now.
What we're seeing in Victoria, is that reason for other states to slow down their easing of restrictions, whether it's borders or those other measures like opening the pubs and clubs? Or should they be holding firm unless there's localised outbreaks in their state?
Unless they've got cases in their state, I don't see any reason for them to change their plans.
Can I ask, just on a slightly different tack, who will be taking over from you as CMO?
Yes, so Professor Paul Kelly will be acting CMO from the end of this week, and then we will run a proper process, as we always do, in the Commonwealth to make a definitive appointment.
Professor, just on the sorry, I have another question about what we're talking about. So just on the Victorian response to this outbreak. So we've known for a couple of weeks now that there have been breaches of infection procedures in these hotels. Has the Victorian health authorities done anything to change? Have they changed contractors? Have they given them extra training?
My understanding is they're doing a very extensive review of the staffing and security provisions in their hotel quarantine, but they do that as a routine. And as I said, we as a nation are all going to look at our practices for hotel quarantine and share the best lessons learned at a meeting later this week.
Professor Matthew, have you had any contact this week or in recent weeks with your international counterparts? And can you give us some insight into how Australia is going in comparison with the international measures?
I haven't had direct personal contact in the last week, but we all see the epidemiology. This disease continues to escalate. There are new countries that become hotspots. Brazil is a big concern at the moment. India is becoming a significant concern. The Americas, South and the North America are accounting for nearly half the cases in the world. We know that if we've got nearly 500,000 deaths around the world, that if you assume a death rate of sort of around 2%, we know that there's significant underreporting of the number of cases. It's likely to be tens of millions of cases that have occurred in the world. This is a serious disease that's with us, and that makes our position relatively very strong, and still is relatively strong, even though we have an issue to deal with at the moment.
Has the HPPC given any updated advice to the states with regards to opening border restrictions?
HPPC has never made an advice on border closures. They have been individual decisions of the states and territories based on their own epidemiology and their own health advice, and the decisions to reopen the borders will be theirs too.
It's been a fortnight since the Black Lives Matters rally. There was obviously another person who attended the rally today with the virus, but probably didn't get it from their attendance and stuff like that. Would you say, given the sort of the 14-day incubation period, that if there had been any people getting the disease from attending these rallies, that we would be seeing it now, and it would suggest that these things aren't super spreader events?
Well, I think a super spreader event you need to have a super spreader there to spread it, and the potential is always there. I think you're probably right that we probably were lucky to have not seen major transmission at any of these events. There were two reasons for us strongly recommending against these events. One was the risk of spreading, but the other is it does send a very difficult message to the rest of the community who are obeying all of the restrictions and the density rules to see people gathering in large numbers in a situation where you can't track who you've been next to. And there is always the potential that people seeing that sort of gathering may have felt less compliant with the regulations in their other aspects of their life. So we still are very strongly discouraging these sort of events.
Can I pitch forward with one other question? What is your assessment of how the quest for a vaccine is coming along? And secondly, what is your assessment of how Australia is placed in terms of manufacturing that vaccine once it's...
Sure. So there are several candidate vaccine molecules in clinical trials at the moment. Probably the first results of any clinical trials will be available in late July. That will be a good time for us to tell whether any of the candidate molecules are looking promising. There are several different types of potential vaccines. We are actively examining manufacturing capacity in Australia. For some of those types of vaccines, we potentially do have good manufacturing capacity. For others, we don't currently have it, and we are exploring that. There's a very significant lot of work being done on vaccines at the moment in the Commonwealth.
Who's leading the work in terms of manufacturing?
So the Commonwealth Department of Industry and of Health are doing some very careful work looking at the scenario around the country.
Will the HPPC ever consider stricter localised lockdowns in those cluster areas? And what would the threshold be? Like, what would be the number of cases to say, look, this localised area is now going to have a 2-week quarantine?
So I think the decision about a local lockdown would rest in the local state and territory public health unit, but they would obviously seek advice from HPPC. Again, there's no magic formula. It's not a total number. It's the rate of rise of cases, it's the number of community transmitted, it's the number of people that don't have an identified contact. So it would be an overall assessment, and there's no, and it would be the capacity physically to localise the outbreak.
But we could see those kinds of strict
That has always been part of our National Cabinet endorsed strategy. If you had, say, a couple of hundred cases in a small geographical area, that area might well be physically locked down. That has always been part of our strategy.
Just on New South Wales opening up, people going to the pub, going back to the gym, you mentioned people having seen those crowds becoming complacent. Are you concerned that New South Wales could see a similar outbreak of in Victoria?
Well, it's always possible in any state. In New South Wales, has always been very open that they have had, until recently, community transmission, and they don't know that they don't have it. So we are always telling people that they must practice those personal responsibility things. So if you're going to a pub or a club, and even if there are large numbers, you must make sure your contact details are left. You've got to practice those personal distancing. You've got to practice those hygienes. Those concerns will be with us for the duration.
On international, sorry.
I'll do two more questions.
On international travel, Professor, we've seen a number of countries, Japan most recently, Singapore, Taiwan, have flagged doing sort of like a green lane travel with Australia, where people can travel with quarantine-free stays when they arrive on their destination. What's the sort of the medical advice from that on your view on that?
Sure.
Is that something that is feasible, or is it a bit unrealistic?
No, if we can be confident that a country is in a very good situation with control of the virus, like New Zealand, and obviously if everyone knows we've been exploring that with New Zealand, then that sort of possibility is there. And we are currently working with New Zealand on what would be the conditions that we would want for that sort of a border reopening to occur.
Is there any evidence that would fall on the estimated death rate as of yet? Do we see any evidence of that at all?
The estimated death rate internationally? Yeah. So at the moment, I still think the best estimate is around 2% is the death rate, and that's why, whilst the international death rate is around 5%, I think there is substantial underdetection of cases around the world. Thank you.
Is that travel bubble with New Zealand at risk now because of this outbreak?
The New Zealand authorities would certainly be concerned about that, and they would be watching that. They've made no decision to...
That's where we'll have to leave that news conference there. Professor Brendan Murphy, Chief Medical Officer, giving an update on COVID-19 around the country. He outlined the national situation. There have been 18 new cases overnight, 2 in New South Wales, 16 in Victoria. These sorts of numbers, Brendan Murphy said, now were expected at the peak last week, the numbers that we're seeing today. Last week they did cause concern, and he repeated the call for people in places in and around Melbourne that have been declared virus hotspots not to travel interstate or beyond, particularly with school holidays coming up in Victoria. He says he has great confidence in Victoria's response to the situation, but it needs to be watched closely over the next couple of days. He also says that the virus is escalating around the world and the risk in Australia is here long term. And latterly there, the first results of a human trial of a vaccine for COVID-19 will be delivered in July. This could be one of the last times that we see Brendan Murphy delivering an update on the coronavirus. We've, of course, got used to seeing him, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, but he's now leaving his post. His deputy, Paul Kelly, will be acting CMO at the end of this week until a replacement is found. Time to check the weather now. Here's Nate Byrne.
A complex low sitting off Tasmania is providing some wet weather today, heavy falls for the south of the state. We could see more than 50 millimetres as the rain continues. Meanwhile, in the west, a frontal system is making an approach, quite a significant one. It's going to bring some damaging winds to the southwest of the state and also some hazardous surf conditions and dangerous surf conditions that could lead to more beach erosion over the first half of the week. Now, we will see that wet weather moving eastwards, but it runs out of steam relatively quickly until it gets to the southeast. A bit more wet weather on the way then. And then to end the week, we've got another major front coming into the west. And there's another one coming in right behind that as well. But for your Tuesday around the capitals, if you're in Brisbane, you've got another mostly sunny day. It's aiming for 20 degrees, 17 in Sydney and 12 for Canberra. After that, the rest of the south has some wet weather to talk about. Melbourne showers through the morning. They should ease though as we progress through the day. 15 degrees will be the top. There's rain for Hobart. The wind will be easing there though, 14 there. For Adelaide, just a possible shower. It's getting to 16. Perth, you've got a bit more wet weather, but your showers are easing too behind that front. 20 will be the top. And for Darwin, it's another sunny day, but temperatures down, only a top of 31.
That's ABC News for now. And a reminder, you can keep up to date with all the latest news across all your devices at news.abc.net.au and on iView. I'm Ros Childs. Coming up on the ABC News channel, Gemma Vanessa will have more on today's top stories, including the latest on those COVID-19 outbreaks in Victoria. Thanks for joining us.